Content warning. This video discusses sexual violence, child dedication, and the coercive exploitation of women. Viewer discretion is advised. Imagine a courtyard. A 9-year-old girl stands with a coil of hair in her hands, the braid cut clean at the nape, as a cold bronze razor glints for a moment in the light. A voice declares her old name dead and offers a new one in its place. This is not a public spectacle. Not yet. This is the moment before the spectacle, a private erasure, an institutional preparation that makes later punishments possible. Before any flogging or display in the forum, something quieter and darker happens. Identity is stripped, bodies are rearranged under the authority of ritual and law, and a system is set in motion that makes lifelong ownership feel ordinary. What follows is an attempt to reconstruct how that private cruelty could have worked for women in Rome. Where the Roman record is fragmentary, we rely on broader Mediterranean patterns and carefully labeled reconstructions. The vignettes you will hear are composites, dramatized scenes assembled from the emotional and procedural traces left across antiquity, adapted here to the Roman context so we can understand the mechanics of control. They are not presented as verbatim historical accounts of named individuals. Instead, they stand for hundreds of lives erased from the archives. She had no name left. The first woman we meet is Nefaria, a composite figure. She is an orphan, her family's debts swallowed by taxes and a failed harvest. A creditor, pressed by the city's collectors, takes her to a religious estate that administers loans and receives tribute. She arrives wearing fragments of the life she once knew, a small pendant, the smell of her mother's hearth. The ledger does not care for memory. In the courtyard she is examined, bathed and raised in a linen robe washed until it looks nearly white. An official checks the ledger, a priest nods, and a ritual follows. Hair is shorn to remove the old signifiers of status and kinship. A new name is spoken, as if to mark a birth into the household of the temple rather than a city family. That new name, given under the authority of ritual, becomes a shorthand for possession. She is now listed not as a citizen's daughter, but as a dependent, an asset, a living tool of the institution. She had no name left. This opening ritual, cleansing, shaving, renaming, functions on multiple levels. It is practical, symbolic, and legal. Practically, short hair makes manual labor easier and is a visible sign that the wearer belongs to the institution. Symbolically, the cutting severs ties to a former identity. Renaming erodes the social root back. Legally, in many ancient contexts, ritual language and public acts could alter a person's status.
In the Roman world, the specifics are complex and uneven. Temples, priesthoods, and wealthy religious foundations held property and influence. Legal texts and inscriptions show a range of relationships between sacred spaces and dependents. Whether every temple used ritual renaming to formalize ownership is not established beyond doubt for Rome. What the wider Mediterranean record does make clear is that ritual and law were frequently braided together to make social hierarchies feel inviolable. In the absence of comprehensive Roman documentation for every practice, the scene of Nefaria is presented here as a composite reconstruction, a plausible mechanism drawn from patterns across antiquity and adapted to a Roman environment to explore how ritual might have been used to erase names and bind lives. After the initiation, daily life compresses into repetitions. Nefaria wakes before dawn to the clatter of pots and the low murmur of instructions. She carries water, crushes grain, threads needles. The buildings are practical and efficient. Workshops, storage rooms, dormitories with narrow cots. Supervisors move through corridors with lists and numbers. There are inspections, there are inventories. Her labor is visible on account books rather than in courtrooms. Surveillance is mundane as much as it is punitive. A small scratch on a stone, a hidden weave in a garment, a lullaby hummed between shifts. These are the private resistances that feed endurance. The institution polices speech and gesture. A forbidden smile at another woman can mean a punishment that is neither recorded nor publicly admitted. Extra work, a locked chest of bread, a humiliating display before a small group. Those punishments rarely reach the open spaces of the city, because punishment here is designed to be a quiet, systematic shaping of behavior rather than an episodic explosion. Our second composite, Mutu, arrives from beyond the city's hard line, a captive of an expedition or the product of a negotiated tribute. Mutu speaks an unfamiliar tongue. Her braided hair and foreign amulet mark another origin. She is an outsider in every sense, easy to register as property because language and kinship that might protect her are absent. In the processing courtyard, she is assigned tasks that harden her body and thin her options: spinning, cleaning, tending animals that belong to temple granaries. Children, when they appear, are removed rapidly from the mother space and integrated into the institution according to its needs. Nursing infants may be kept for a time, then taken as apprentices or assigned elsewhere. Birth is not a route to security here. Motherhood is often turned into a risk. The legal status of enslaved women in Roman law was complex. They could be property, could be manumitted, could gain limited rights in some contexts, and yet their bodily autonomy was constrained in ways that modern eyes recognize as exploitation.
The record for specific temple-linked mechanisms that appropriated children systematically is partial. Where we dramatize the seizure of newborns and the repurposing of children, this is a reconstruction designed to show the emotional logic and possible institutional incentives behind such acts. There is a ritual mechanism that appears throughout the Mediterranean, a marriage-like form that places a woman in a perpetual relationship with a sacred institution rather than a mortal spouse. The language used to describe this phenomenon varies by place and time. In Rome, the best-known female religious office is that of the Vestal Virgins, priestesses entrusted with sacred duties, legally and socially distinct from enslaved women. Vestals enjoyed privileges and legal protections. Their institution is not proof of a system of temple slavery. Scholars caution against simple equations between religious offices and forced servitude. Yet other records and comparative evidence from the region speak to practices where religious rhetoric legitimized prolonged sexual access, labor, and control. In some pagan culted contexts, dedicatory language described offerings given to the god, and in other sources the metaphor of marriage to a deity is present. When institutions who managed land and credit claimed the right to dedicate persons to their service, ritual language could be mobilized to create a social climate where non-consensual sexual access and exploitation became routinized, cloaked in sanctity. In this narration, those scenarios are treated carefully as interpretive reconstructions, plausible configurations that help explain how ritual and law might have been combined to produce what looks like ownership. Where Roman law offers clearer guidance about property and citizenship, we note it. Where the evidence is thin, we mark the scene as a composite, plausible but not a direct transcription of an individual record. The phrase divine marriage or sacred union appears in many modern summaries of ancient religious life, but it can obscure as much as it reveals. In the reconstructed scenes, we are not invoking a mystical covenant that women freely entered. We mean a ritualized structure, a ceremony, a verbal formula, an administrative note that served to authorize non-consensual sexual access under a theological frame. Institutional actors could use the guise of religion to normalize practices they wanted to shield from civic scrutiny. The ritual becomes a technique of governance. It secures compliance, creates silence, and fragments the memory of origin. Daily life under such systems produces a set of predictable humiliations and violences that are sober in their regularity. There are mandatory inspections where bodies are scanned for signs of pregnancy or illness. There are punishments calibrated to prevent solidarity. The tools of control are both material and symbolic.
The shorn braid is not merely a haircut. It is a visible mark that can be demanded by a ledger. The white linen robe is not simply clothing. It is a uniform that announces belonging. Food rations are a lever. Access to family news is restricted. In some reconstructions, there are lists in storerooms that tally human beings alongside oxen and grain. In others, a ledger notes payments, loans, and the transfer of dependents between households and sanctuaries. We must be careful with specifics. Roman administrative records show complex property transactions and detailed tax lists, but direct analogs to every form of temple-based human accounting are not always preserved. Still, the combination of economic power, social prestige, and legal ambiguity made religious institutions effective hubs for acquiring and controlling labor. Pregnancy is one of the quietest horrors. If a woman becomes pregnant, institutional managers make decisions based on utility. Can the child be raised as a future laborer, sold, or transferred as part of a donation? Sometimes a newborn is kept as an apprentice. Sometimes a child is absorbed into another household's workforce. These are not dramatic scenes in public records. They are choices recorded as matter-of-fact entries, or not recorded at all. We reconstruct what many survivors' traces suggest: mothers forced to hand their infants to officials, then watching from the courtyard as newborns are led away with sacks of grain. The memory of such separations endures in scratchings, and in the few dramatic legal cases that appear in court records where a mother fights for recognition. Such court cases are the exception. For most, the law offered limited recourse against powerful institutions that blended sacred status with economic clout. Resistance is everywhere it can be hidden. In Nefaria's dormitory, she bites a stitch into a hymn that spells her birth name in coded knots. Mutu sings lullabies in a tongue few officials understand, folding meaning into melody. Other women carve short messages into lintels or on the back of a storage crate, names, dates, pleas. Archaeologists sometimes uncover these marks, tiny, furtive, persistent. An inscription scratched into a stone can read, in fragmentary form, "I was born free." We do not have endless testimonies. What we do have are shards that hint at a stubborn insistence on personhood. These tokens of resistance are small, but their existence proves that even under comprehensive regimes of erasure, memory persists. Death and erasure in these systems do not always end in celebrated martyrdom or public rogues displays. When death occurs, burial practices can be withheld or anonymized. Mass graves on the edges of estates, unmarked pits at the back of sanctuaries, and the lack of permitted mourning rituals are ways in which the living are told, visibly and legally, to forget.
The political purpose of such forgetting is clear. If a person is not counted as a member of a family or community, their disappearance attracts less attention. In Rome, the archaeological evidence for neglected burials associated specifically with temple dependents is uneven. We must therefore speak carefully. Still, comparative patterns in the ancient world show that institutions often treated dependent dead as utilitarian problems rather than as persons deserving of public remembrance. The act of forbidding mourning is itself a form of punishment, a way to enforce the social message that these lives were outside the circle of kinship. Throughout the narrative, the state of law matters. Roman law differentiated free citizens and non-citizens, citizens and enslaved persons, with a dense web of legal principles. Enslaved persons had no formal legal personhood in many respects, though laws did govern certain protections, sales, and manumissions. When religious institutions intersected with these legal categories, the result could be a thicket where abuses went unchallenged. Temples and their administrators could be powerful economic actors. They received donations, managed land, extended loans, and extracted rents. Those economic functions offered opportunities to convert debt and dependency into persons placed under institutional control. The chain is logical, if horrifying. Credit extended to a family, a default on repayment, the transfer of a dependent into the care of a creditor. Ritual language and administrative forms then make the arrangement appear normative and binding. It is crucial here to state a historical caveat. Many of the most dramatic scenes we portray, the forced dedications that read like sales contracts between a family and a temple, the ritual language that equates a woman's body with sacred property, are composite reconstructions adapted to a Roman setting. Some legal procedures and institutional behaviors are well attested in Roman archival materials. Others are better documented in neighboring cultures or in fragmentary sources. Where specifics for Rome are ambiguous, this film labels the scenes as reconstructions intended to illuminate how the interplay of ritual, law, and economic power could function. The traces of resistance we do find are often indirect. A woman writing her name as a small sigil on a pot inside a kiln, a scratched phrase on a millstone, a woven pattern that encodes a vanished song. These are the fingerprints of human defiance. There are also stories, sparse and scattered, of women who fled, who petitioned magistrates, who struck bargains for manumission, and who, in rare cases, succeeded in reclaiming a legal identity. Such victories were exceptions that illuminate a broader reality. Power is consolidated through routine compliance as much as through exceptional enforcement.
When we examine the monuments, the temples, and the civic inscriptions of ancient cities, we tend to see their public faces, dedications, triumphs, benefactions. What we often do not see is the private administration, the ledgers, the dormitories, the quiet rituals by which people were converted into dependents. To look at a temple and imagine only piety is to miss the other side of its function as an economic node. Religious rhetoric could sanctify an arrangement that made exploitation appear legitimate. That does not mean the religion itself is the villain. Rather, it means that institutions can be pressed into service as instruments of social control. There are ways to root these reconstructions in known Roman elements while acknowledging the gaps. For example, Roman temples did own property and had legal standing. Priests could be influential figures with close ties to elite families. Legal mechanisms in Rome allowed for forms of servitude and debt bondage that could, in practice, be ruthless. But the specific ritual acts of shaving, renaming, and sacred union as a standardized policy across all temples in Rome are not uniformly documented. Some practices may have existed in pockets, in particular regions, or as part of ad hoc arrangements. Others may reflect parallel practices in nearby cultures. Because the evidence is incomplete, we present the personal scenes as composites that translate emotionally and structurally into a Romanized frame. Where the Roman record is clear, we highlight it. Where it is not, we are transparent about this being a reconstruction meant to reveal mechanisms rather than claim exhaustive documentary proof. One recurring motif in survivors' traces is the repetition of a single phrase or likeness, the loss of a name. Names are social property. They connect a person to family, to memory, to legal standing. When a name is removed, shaved away like a braid, replaced in a ritual voice, memory loses its anchor. That is why small acts of reclamation, like a stitched name inside a hymn, become sacred. They are the last testament against erasure. The ethical question we end with is not academic. When we walk through ancient ruins, through columns and pediments, across plazas where civic life once boiled, we inherit a narrative shaped by the winners who built the monuments. Those stones tell a partial truth. For every public pageant that celebrated power, there is another, quieter set of practices that kept the power supplied. Remembering the private cruelties that preceded a public punishment reframes how we think about monuments. The architecture of a temple or a public forum does not simply embody religious devotion or civic pride. It also housed systems that could, in the name of the sacred and in the language of law, turn people into objects of institutional need.
At the close, consider this. When museums and cities preserve the achievements of antiquity, they must also make space for the stories of those whose labor and bodies made those achievements possible. The stones do not speak for themselves. It is our task to attend to the margins where memory persists. She had no name left, and in small, private gestures, she kept that name alive. If you want more hidden histories like this reconstructed together, histories that try to listen for voices under the monument, subscribe. We leave you with a final image, an empty cradle on a scrim of linen, a small braid of hair tied with a faded thread beside it, and a scratched, fragmentary line on the hearthstone, "I was born free." Whether carved in rage or in desperation, the line insists on a truth the ledgers try to erase. People were here, and they mattered. Share your thoughts below. If this moved you, subscribe to learn more about the lives erased by history.